Welcome and good morning. Welcome to the second day of the Responsible Business and Human Rights Forum. My name is Sean Lees, and I am the Business and Human Rights Specialist working at the United Nations Development Program alongside my colleague Livio Sarandrea. Now, as you will remember, a lot was made at the opening of our forum about the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, the so-called twin resolutions from the General Assembly and from the Human Rights Council. But whether these twin resolutions will actually amount to meaningful impact on the ground is subject to some debate. According to some experts, politics, economics, power will have a more important role in setting the pace of progress against air pollution concerns, water pollution problems, and climate change. After all, as noted in the Environmental and Human Rights Defenders session, the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is in many constitutions of the countries in our region already. They've been identified. It's been identified as a right to many citizens, particularly in Southeast Asia. And I think in yesterday's session, a presentation on Indonesia made a remark about that. So how will international recognition make a difference? That's one of the themes of our session today. And while it's not clear yet just what kind of impact these new twin resolutions will make, what is certain is that the twin resolutions will be fully leveraged by, I think, the community here, by people in this room, to help push environmental issues to the top of the business and human rights agenda. And sensing this, UNDP, in partnership with the European Union, has been holding a series of discussions and a series of reports about the linkages between the business and human rights agenda and the environment. We have discussed air pollution, water pollution, and climate change in some detail, and these reports will be coming out periodically over the next 6 months. Now, in initial discussions, 3 items have emerged as priority issues across all 3 different areas of environmental priorities. The need to strengthen enforcement of existing laws, to commit to data gathering and analysis, and to fill capacity gaps, mostly of government. I'd like to explore these themes more deeply today, but also move into new directions, especially as they involve the question of leverage, the theme of our Responsible Business and Human Rights Forum this year. What can be leveraged to ensure greater attention to address environmental harms in Asia? And how do we leverage power to reduce business impacts on the environment? How do we leverage, indeed, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights as a framework for action? Do we need new tools? Do we need more tools, in fact? Well, to help answer these questions and explore these issues more widely, I've assembled the following panelists. Let me start with Diane Archer, a senior research fellow at Stockholm Environment Institute, who focuses on climate change and its impacts on cities in Asia. Dr. Surya Deva, professor of the Macquarie Law School in Sydney and director of the Center for Environmental Law. To my left, I have Winarin Luleratonda, co-founder of the Thai Clean Air Network, and Matthew Baird, director of the Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law and an expert on water pollution, among other environmental issues. Now, Sushmita Mandal, also from SEI, had to pull out at the last moment due to health concerns. We wish her well, but a big thanks for Matthew for pulling in and filling her spot at the last second. And again, many thanks from the organizers for that. Well, without further ado, allow me to start the session by turning first to Diane. Diane, the risk management firm Verisk Maplecroft produced a report last year that found that among the top 100 cities most impacted by climate change, that 99 of them were found in Asia. Around the same time, around the same month and time of year, I think the Asia Development Bank also released a report saying that Asian cities were responsible for huge sources of carbon emissions and other toxins. In fact, it said, quote, in its report, in the next 20 years, Asian cities will contribute more than half the rise contribute to more than half the rise in global emissions if no action is taken. Now, already the region contributes 51% of the carbon emissions in the globe today. So my first question to you and Diane is climate change really an Asian challenge? Is climate change, because we live in cities that are more vulnerable than many others in the world, because this region is so vulnerable and because it's contributing so much to the problem, is Asia at the center of the climate change debate? Thank you.
Thanks, Sean, and thanks very much for inviting me to join this panel. Firstly, yes, I agree that climate change is definitely a big issue for Asia. We've seen this month in Bangkok higher than average rainfall over the last couple of weeks that have caused flooding across the city. In Pakistan, they've seen terrible floods in the last month as well. But I think when firstly, I don't think it's necessarily helpful to try and pin blame on particular cities or actors or parts of the world. But if we are going to be doing that, then I think we need to be realistic. Looking at CO2 emissions per capita, the US and Canada are still way ahead of China, Thailand, most Asian or all Asian countries, pretty much. So it's not necessarily helpful to say, Asian cities are to blame. And we also have to also see how we attribute the CO2 emissions or other greenhouse gas emissions. So a lot of activity in Asian cities is actually to meet the needs of consumers in the West as well. So all the manufacturing that's happening in Asia is to supply consumers' needs in the Western world as well. So I think we need to bear that in mind when we start the discussion.
Fair enough. Indeed, Asia as the factory to the world is going to, by very definition, be responsible for more greenhouse gas emissions than other regions, that being so. Let me ask you to delve a little bit more further into your research. You've written that the growing international awareness of cities as priority sites for climate action needs to be combined with a focus on the priorities and potential of low-income residents in order to achieve climate adaptation that leaves no urban citizens behind. Can you give us some key findings from your work, from your studies, and maybe focus, if you would, on the vulnerabilities of informal workers in cities?
So I think, as you say, there are a large number of people living in Asian cities who are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. This comes down to the difference between coping capacity and adaptive capacity to climate change. So, for example, if you have a very low income or an insecure income, so you're looking for work day to day, or you're a street vendor, and so you never know how much you're going to be earning in a particular day, you're already on the back foot, as it were, because you might not have the necessary safety nets that allow you to have or to build up adaptive capacity to climate change. So, for example, savings in the bank as an important one, but also things like insurance. Is your house insured? Do you even have a right written down on paper, the secure tenure over your house? If it gets flooded, will you be allowed to return to your house? That's a big issue for a lot of people who live in informal settlements who, as a result of disaster, may find themselves kicked off their place of abode, but also often a place where a lot of their economic activity takes place, or they might store their equipment, such as their vending cart or other equipment that's essential to their livelihood. Do they have access to social security? This is not a given if they're informal workers. And do they have access to free or affordable healthcare? Again, not a given for very many people across Asia. So if a disaster strikes, like a big flood or a big storm, they're already in a much more difficult situation compared to, say, the middle classes who can access insurance for their property, who have access to healthcare, social security, who have savings in the bank, hopefully, in order to be able to prepare themselves for incidences such as this, but also to be able to recover and move on rather than end up being in a worse off situation.
Right, recovery is the more difficult part. And indeed, the plight of vulnerables in cities and elsewhere. The plight of vulnerable groups in cities or as informal workers and elsewhere is an important subject for us to study in the context of climate change, and I applaud your work in that area. And indeed, leaving no one behind, another theme of your work, is very central to the work of UNDP and as key concept or principle driving the sustainable development goals. However, I want to ask whether all our focus on vulnerable groups doesn't come with trade-offs as well. I mean, vulnerable groups are, by definition, less powerful. Some would even say powerless. Might it also be important for our studies to focus on the plight of the middle class and how climate change is going to impact the middle class to better galvanize the power of the middle class through elections and through purchasing power, through other forms of influence?
I mean, I think it's an interesting question, an interesting way of framing it. I would argue that in order to really achieve inclusive, resilient, sustainable cities, we really need to focus on everyone, and I think probably put more energy into supporting those who have the least power and the least voice. The vote of an informal worker counts just as much as the vote of the CEO of a company, or it should do. And so I think if we can focus our attentions on, for example, supporting informal and low-income populations to firstly better understand. Focus our attentions on building the awareness and understanding of population groups who might have other priorities. And I think we need to understand that, like, they might not be able to worry about the next flood because they're worrying about what to have for dinner tomorrow or tonight.
Right.
And so how can we better direct our attentions to support these population groups? And I think part of the answer is also working with the governments to make sure that they don't leave these population groups behind, and that they understand that the informal sector is vital to our economies. For example, Bangkok would collapse if it had no motorbike taxi drivers, no taxi drivers,
No doubt.
no tuk-tuk drivers. They all work in the informal sector, and all the street vendors who feed our security guards, our cleaners, and so on.
Indeed.
So they're essential to the economy. So I don't think we can leave them behind. That doesn't mean we can't also work with the middle class constituents to also get them to push for more action on behalf of the government, maybe through mechanisms like social media and so on, but that can also reach the urban poor groups too.
Thank you, Diane. And indeed, I like the feeling I'm getting here about your acceptance that power is important to re-engineering to the extent we need to economies, re-engineering how we go about our business. Focus on vulnerables doesn't suggest it's a dead end. In fact, the vulnerables, as you rightly point out, the vulnerables, a terrible way of putting it, but vulnerable groups, in fact, do have power. They are sometimes less organized than other groups. So, if I may, Surya, let me switch over to you now on the question of power. The truth is, buyers have had a lot of power over their suppliers. Vendor, that's always the case. A consumer has power over a business, theoretically at least. The EU has had a significant amount of buying power and is able to dictate new norms, and sometimes while others bristle at the introduction of these new norms. In fact, the EU is proposing a new deforestation directive that would, among other things, benchmark countries for deforestation risks. U.S. Congress, another powerful state, or rather a powerful state, is considering legislation that would allow trade sanctions against countries that do not impose controls on carbon emissions. And of course, there's this new mandatory environmental and human rights due diligence that's also making its way from proposal to full-blown directive at the European Union, among other things. Is it possible that, however, all these regulations might cause international business to either turn away from Asia because of compliance costs, but also Asian businesses to turn away from Western markets? And do we then fall in the trap of creating two parallel systems two parallel economies essentially on the global stage. Might we be moving too fast for developing Asian companies and developing Asian economies to catch up?
Thanks, Sean, for the invitation. And before I answer this question, let me pick up from what Dan was saying in terms of, in response to your question about whether the Asia is the problem or the challenge in terms of climate change. And I think that will connect nicely with this regulatory paradigm that you are referring coming from the global north, primarily, right? And how we should be responding to that. I think we should keep the colonial history in mind when we are talking about climate change. And I think the global south and developing countries have a right to development. I think we cannot ignore that aspect. We cannot say that the West has developed and now we should not allow the developing countries in the global south to fulfill their legitimate development pathways and aspirations. So the crucial thing is that developing countries in Asia or global south generally, they should not make the same mistakes that were made by the West earlier. I think that is the point that I would like to make. So I think Asia can be different. That could be a departure point for us. Now, in terms of the regulatory paradigm that you're talking about, those examples that you're giving, my feeling is that some of those regulatory paradigms, including the EU directive, it is not going to change much on the ground. So I may little bit deviate from the mainstream BHR narrative.
Okay. Well, why do you say that? Why do you say it's not going to change things?
Why I'm saying it? Because first of all, most of these regulations coming out of Europe or US, they don't understand the business realities in Asia. So Dan was giving very concrete examples of small street vendors. So are these regulations capturing the business enterprises in Thailand, in Vietnam, in India, in China? Are they capturing that? So I think they're not even understanding what the root causes of the problem are. So I think that's where, in my view, this is not going to fix the issues. This may result in shifting the risks from one jurisdiction to another jurisdiction. So businesses are always creative. They want to minimize their cost. So businesses may move from one jurisdiction to another. It may encourage tick box compliance on the part of businesses. Lawyers are often, I'm a trained lawyer, but lawyers are often part of the problem in guiding businesses. So I really worry about these regulations, that are they going to be good enough? We need mandatory regulations, so don't get me wrong. But what we also need is we need incentives for businesses. How do we create tax incentives for green business? How do we use public procurement in a positive manner? How do we also build capacity of businesses here? Like technology transfer is a big issue. So how many of these European companies and states and US and Canada and global north is going to share the technology with the global south companies? Is that happening? So I think technology transfer is very crucial. And if I could just add one more point about coherence. Policy coherence is very critical in terms of achieving the objectives of regulation. So here, coherence is also about businesses. So businesses should not talk about respecting human rights and behind the scene they are doing lobbying against progressive regulations. So I think that is incoherence. But I think the coherence is also relevant from the perspective of states. So what about the trade and investment agreements? So same governments, when they are negotiating trade and investment agreements, they are not as ambitious in terms of promoting environment and climate change when it comes to those trade interests, right? So I think those are the issues that we need to capture. So that is a complex answer to your question.
In some ways, it's spot on and very straightforward, too. You're saying it's not a question of whether we're moving too fast for developing Asian economies. You're saying it may not be relevant because they're not taking Asian economic considerations in mind as they develop these regulations.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, Sean, we can never be too fast to deal with climate change, let me put it this way. Okay. So I think that is not perhaps the right way to put it. But the real issue is, do we understand how to fix climate change? And I think it requires a cohesive, holistic response. And I think the lead has to be taken by the Asia. It cannot be the top-down model of regulation coming from Europe And without understanding the local realities, that will fix the issue here, in my view.
Let me ask you one follow-up question, and please be brief because I have a more important question after this, or as an important question after this. We could all agree Asia should take the lead. Asia needs to take the initiative on its own, regardless of what sort of regulatory requirements are coming from other regions. But is it likely, first of all, that you're going to have policy coherence? Policy coherence doesn't exist because of politics and because of local realities. Is policy coherence very likely? Tech transfers in this climate, with the geopolitical tensions between Pacific powers at a high pitch, is it likely? And my question to you is, what's the most likely thing, or what is the easiest, what is the low-hanging fruit that we can pick that is going to drive action on either climate change, air pollution, or water pollution?
I mean, a very low-hanging fruit is each one of us in this room and in Asia or anywhere in the world can change how we live our lives. That's a low-hanging fruit.
Okay,
so we can start living
what at scale,
differently.
though? What do we do at scale? What is the
That is a
low-hanging
big
fruit?
scale, no? If everyone starts behaving differently, let us say I live in a 5-star hotel, and if I don't change my towel every day, that is a change. That will contribute to the big picture, right? So I think we are talking about policy coherence at the broad level, but we are talking about policy coherence in the life of each one of us. I think that's where I would suggest indigenous peoples are a great champion of dealing with climate change. We need to learn from them how to have a contract with social harmony with nature. How do we live in harmony with nature is the way we can learn from them. So learning from past to deal with the future challenge, in my view, is the solution. And of course, we need to push the decision makers, we as consumers, we as investors, we as students, we as whoever we are. We need to ensure the decision makers take policy decisions which are in line with our aspirations, rather than the other way around.
Music to my ears. But let me ask you this. Is the UN guiding principles helpful in this regard? Are the UN guiding principles that framework that helps us make change at the individual, at the regional, at the international levels? What do the UN guiding principles mean in the context of climate change? Are they fit for purpose?
I think I don't want to be too much provocative on this, but I will suggest UN guiding principles provide a good starting point.
Okay.
They don't mention climate change anywhere. They don't mention even environmental rights anywhere. And I think that's where, when I was on the working group, we started drafting an information note on climate change, that what it means. So I think there are interlinkages between human rights and climate change, and I think that's where they provide a good starting point. But I think they will not be enough on their own to solve the problem, in my view. Okay. And let me show what I mean by this. One key tool in Pillar 2 is human rights due diligence. But when we talk about climate change, the human rights due diligence may look very differently, in my view, because there are differences in terms of human rights and climate change. There are conceptual differences. Human rights are typically individualistic. Climate change is an issue which is very much collective and transborder and global in nature. When we deal with human rights, companies can easily identify who they have to consult. Climate change, a company may need to consult 7 billion people, because whatever a company is doing is impacting somehow directly or indirectly. So how do you deal with that particular situation? So identifying the adverse impact, identifying the people who are impacted is very, very complex, in my view. So I think human rights due diligence, even if it is holistic and captures environment and climate change, I think that is a starting point, but that won't fix everything, because we need to go, in my view, towards a degrowth model of business, not green growth, degrowth. And I think we need to move towards changing the business models which are exploitative and which cannot be fixed.
Okay, degrowth versus green growth.
It's not versus,
that's
but
a hard
yes.
one to leave without unpacking that further, but unfortunately we need to. And in part because, and as I move, thank you, Surya, for your comments. As we move to Weena, it does sometimes seem like all the environmental conversations are about climate change. And yet, as you and I have spoken about recently, air pollution is a far greater concern for most Asians that are surveyed, that are asked. Air pollution is the top priority according to a survey we conducted, an unscientific survey, but still a survey, and by a much bigger measure than climate change. Should the United Nations and other international bodies, governments, foundations, etc., should we be focused on air pollution concerns to a much greater degree than we are currently? Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me for this panel. The answer to your question, Sean, is yes. So based on the WHO numbers, about 7 million people dying prematurely because of air pollution. Some research actually has the numbers up to 10 million people. And the majority of those people actually live in the Asia-Pacific region. So it is a huge problem that affects us here. Thailand specifically, there was a report that was done by the University of Chicago, the Air Quality Life Index. In 2020, which is the COVID year, air pollution in terms of PM 2.5 in Thailand actually increased about 23%. So that actually didn't reduce, right? Even though people think it had. And we are ranked as the 4th worst in terms of number of people, premature death within ASEAN. Right, so we don't look so great, and ASEAN regionally doesn't look great. Of course, the epicenter is South Asia. We have China and Vietnam, and a lot of Indonesia. A lot of countries are impacted by this. Now, going back specifically to your question, the problem there was a report done by the Global Air Quality Funding Report that was done in 2022, and only 0.5% of international development funding is going to address air pollution, which is extremely low. And on philanthropic funding, only 0.1% is going towards this. In terms of international public money going towards climate finance, only 2.2% is going to address specifically air pollution. So 98% of climate finance money out there is not even focused on air pollution specifically. So there's definitely dual benefits, because the cause of air pollution and climate change have similar causes and similar effects, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's like short-range air pollutants account 50% of the climate change impacts. So there's definitely joint benefits to address this together.
If air pollution is a number one concern, or should be a number one concern for Asian people who live in Asia, and it's linked, as you're making this at this final moment, or at the end here, linked to climate change, is fixing air pollution and focusing on air pollution a way of also addressing climate change? Should that be a strategy for addressing climate change in Asia?
Definitely, that should be a strategy. Okay. And unfortunately, because of the way funding is right now, the focus isn't that way. So with the multilateral development institutions, unfortunately, the focus is not on air pollution. And I can share anecdotally that we've had high-level discussions with some of the multilateral development banks, and their focus is not there. And speaking to people who are active citizens trying to pursue this, they've actually told us, why don't you go speak to the Thai government and convince them that they need multilateral development support, right, and pay for it, because Thailand is no longer a Part 2 country, so we don't qualify for a lot of funding support, and therefore, actually, the Thai government has to partially fund a lot of the support that comes now from multilateral development institution. But to be asking civil society and active citizens to actually be the one to justify it is amazing, and that's the kind of environment that we're living in when it comes to pushing on the clean air movements here.
Your colleague Diane is also a big believer that we need to focus on air pollution more too. She wrote in a paper in 2021 saying that we might have the legislation in place, but the real problem is ineffective implementation. What is holding us back from effective implementation on such a pressing issue?
Okay, let me just qualify that a little bit. Dan and I had a quick chat. So on the report that was done, what SEI said is that there is legislation, but it's very, very scattered, and it's not as effective. And implementation is a big problem. Air pollution is an invisible killer. You don't see it, so a lot of people don't have that awareness about it, and it is a systemic problem. You have laws that are too scattered. You have laws that are inadequate to deal with it. And, the key performance indicator for a lot of government agencies, there isn't one in Thailand that's fully responsible for managing air pollution, by the way. You've got a pollution control department, which doesn't have the budgetary might, or they don't have the sufficient allocation of funds to be able to manage this, nor do they have legislative might to be able to address this issue on their own, right? So they need to work across the ministries to do that. And other ministries are not set up to address issues, environmental issues or air pollution issues, right? A lot of them that can make an impact are focused more on economic growth. So there's a dichotomy there. And so it's a huge systemic problem. And one of the things that the Thailand Clean Air Network, which is one of the entities I co-founded, our focus is really to try to solve this problem systemically through pushing for a citizen-driven clean air legislation that deals with the systemic problem and actually goes to Suray's point about economic incentives, because we don't believe command and control is the way to move economic actors to do what's needed to resolve environmental problems. And so in this legislation, there is a lot of economic incentives built in for the private sector, for different actors to do what is right to green their operation sufficiently so we will have clean air to breathe.
So tell me a little bit more about the citizen-led bill. The name of the bill again?
Oh, it's extremely long.
Like most names and titles. But okay, let's just call it the citizen-led bill.
Okay.
What was the reception like, and where is it now? I know that you tabled it earlier this year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We had 26,500 Thai citizens support it. There is a leeway in Thai legislation that allows citizens to submit draft legislation to Parliament for consideration. It sounds great on paper. Reality is much, much difficult. We had to do this over 2 years of COVID, right? We had to do it on paper for most of the time. By the time we've tabled it to Parliament, so it now actually sits with the Prime Minister. It was open up for public consultation process, and 1,050 Thais actually did that. But they opened it up during Songkran, which is the period of the longest public holiday in Thailand, right? So we were working against a tsunami, really. But right now, it now sits with the Prime Minister. Okay. The Thai Prime Minister has actually the leeway to take a decision on whether he will on forward it to Parliament for consideration, or he kills it. And the odds are not looking very good. And unfortunately, the whole process in Thailand, it's not transparent. So you don't know where legislation actually stands, right? So for example, there's other citizens-driven legislation in Thailand. In the past, it's taken about 20 to 35 years to pass. I don't think we have the luxury
Don't have the
for
luxury
the
of
health.
time. No,
Yeah.
Another theme of this panel, and if I could just ask one more question, because it is a breaking news question. Just a couple weeks ago, it might have been last week, the Francis Crick Institute in the UK released a study that drew a link between lung cancer and air pollution. This has eluded scientists for decades. They finally found a link. It still needs to be peer-reviewed. But you've spoken to me in the past about stories of children in the north getting lung pollution. Getting cancer. The only explanation being air pollution, because their parents weren't smokers. But let me ask you a more challenging question. Not what do you think of the science, and does it seem real to you? That might be self-evident. Even if we can make the link between air pollution and lung cancer, who do we hold accountable? Which industry, business? How will we hold accountable industry for the health care that's required, for the cost of health care, to put that child and put that family back to a position of being whole again? How will we hold people responsible for air pollution when it is, by definition, ambient, by definition, a part of a wider space? It's really hard to assign accountability in.
That's a good question. Okay, there's a concept of polluter pay principle. And when it's air pollution, which is invisible to the naked eye, right? Right now, what's happening in Thailand, we have what my environmental lawyer calls taxpayer policy. We are paying for it. right? We're paying it for the massive amount of healthcare that we all individually suck up, basically, or the government is paying it for it, for the costs. So Thailand, for example, there was a study done on the impact of just PM10 using 2019 data. The loss in terms of GDP, the social cost of air pollution was around 11.6% of GDP. So collectively, we are paying for it, right? Now, how do you assign, this to the right entity who is polluting? The way that we've been doing this through this legislation is we have a clean air fund. Now, the Clean Air Fund tries to capture the concept of polluter pay principle in here by doing what? By actually levying an additional add-on amount to the excise tax. So if you're a business, like we all are polluters at the end of the day, right? I mean, we drive a car, maybe we sit a bus, whatever, but the footprint differs. So as an individual, I'm sure I do not pollute as much as a big corporation, right? So what it does is then it imposes an additional excise tax. So if you're importing machineries and things for your business that is polluting, right, then you'll be slapped with this higher excise tax. Now, when you add this all in, this fund will be used for what? For environmental remediation. So if, and also to deal with environmental lawsuits, right? So a lot of people won't have the means to be able to go after companies that are doing this and are the source of the health problems that they're facing. It will also be used for taking care of people who are victims of air pollution. And it will also be used to help subsidize or to help companies who want to green their operations as well. So it's not I think with something like air pollution or any environmental issue, there is no us or them. These issues are intertwined. Like Surya and Diane was saying, these things are all intertwined. And so what it does is then it will provide the support needed for economic actors who want to retrofit their operations.
Going back to the incentives. Yes,
exactly.
Yes.
And that's how you hold people to account. And then we also will link stuff with satellite data as well.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Indeed, the technologies that are emerging now, putting very significant technologies in the hands of individuals through your smartphones and other instruments is really surprising and maybe a big part of the solution for both air pollution and climate change. Another subject I'd like to take up at another opportunity. Thank you, Weena, for your comments. Matthew. I want to switch gears again and now to water pollution. One of the priorities that gets the least amount of attention, but has indeed is perhaps one of the biggest. How should I put it? The statistics on water pollution for Asia are absolutely shocking. That's how we want to put it. And let me read a few. Approximately 50% of the rivers in Asia are choked with high levels of mineral fertilizers, runoff from agricultural settings. We learned that 88% of plastic pollution in the world today comes from rivers in Asia. 110 million people in Southeast Asia live without access to clean water. There's a lot to unpack under each one of those statistics, but I think each one of them is harrowing. How did it get this way? And what leverage do we need to gain, do we need to pull at to ensure greater access to clean water in Asia, and to do so quickly?
Thanks, Sean. I think one of the things about pollution is that we have to recognize that it is that third great environmental crisis. It's not just something that we can, think about for the rainy day once we've solved climate change or biodiversity collapse. It's very clear that pollution, air, water, land, is destroying our environment and our communities. And those statistics are just the tip of what is really a great and growing crisis of pollution, of water pollution and air pollution. And I think the work that the Thailand Clean Air Network has done, fighting and trying to persuade an immovable object to actually act on something that it is a catastrophe. We were talking before, I used to live in Chiang Mai for 9 years, and every month, which then meant to 2 months, which then meant to 5 months, air pollution would become a health hazard. an actual recognised health hazard. And the same with water pollution. And I know I meant to focus on water pollution. And perhaps I can say that there are two things as to why we are in this position of massive pollution crisis. And the first is regulatory failure. That the regulators have not used the tools that are available to regulate industry in particular from its pollution. Every country in Southeast Asia has pollution control legislation. They all have limits. ASEAN has water quality limits. They are all there. They're just not applied and enforced. But secondly, and this is an important thing, we have had a business or a market failure. The market has not adapted to the need to resolve the pollution crisis, which is something we've been talking about for 30 years. Which gets back to a point that I'm very passionate about. It's the idea of incentives. And I believe we have to create incentives for companies to do the right thing and to comply with laws. And it's called prosecute. Prosecute, prosecute, prosecute. It's sending directors to jail. It's sending company officials to jail for failing to do their legal duties. It's making sure shareholders are punished through fines that are then used perhaps to fix up the pollution impacts, both in terms of environment and society. And so the incentive is to say, if you fail to comply with the law, you will go to jail, you will have your assets seized, your company will be fined, which may have a consequence for workers, but at the same time, those worker consequences for the 400 or the 1,000 employees have to be balanced by the tens of thousands of people and the environmental harm. And so it is this question that I think we've come to the point where we have to say a business had the opportunity for voluntary compliance. We've had the UN Guiding Principles for 11 years. We have had the regulatory failure, so government bears its obligations for its failure to comply with Pillar 1, its obligation to protect human rights. But we now have to say to business, you had your opportunity to step up, to adopt voluntary compliance, or even to comply with the law. You failed to do so. The incentive is that if you don't comply with the law, you will be prosecuted. And that has an economic cost.
I don't want to give the impression that I disagree, because I actually do. But the moderator should keep his opinion to himself. Let me ask you this, though. What do we do about SMEs? SMEs, are you subjecting SMEs to the same sort of treatment? Do we take family-run businesses and prosecute them for the water pollution that they might be causing? How much of all of these principles do we apply to micro enterprises, for example?
So look, I mean, this is a very important question, and the issue about smallholding farmers who may apply pesticides and who may be, that means polluting waters. And I think it's really important that we have to also understand what an SME is, a small and medium enterprise. Is that a one-person family unit, a small 10-person agribusiness, a collective? And one of the things about prosecutions, whether it's in waste or air pollution or water pollution, is the need for the prosecutors to be trained certainly on human rights principles, but also in environmental justice principles, so that they go after the people who are most culpable for the incident, who are causing the most amount of harm. And that might be a large-scale agricultural cooperative. It might not be the small-scale, small shareholder or the small farmer. And we saw this in China, where China, having had this idea of growth at any cost, realised that they had a huge environmental liability bill. And then, because the communities were then being oppressed by the weight of their environmental disasters, they then had to take action. And they then instituted environmental courts, they instituted prosecutions, public interest environmental cases, and they started prosecuting everyone, including farmers who were littering, and they soon realised that they had to actually focus on the enterprises, the large-scale enterprises, that not only were causing the environmental harm, in particular water pollution, but they had the obligations and the money to fix it. And so I think when we look at SMEs, we have to look at their impact. For example, for me, a small, medium enterprise that has human rights violations because of child labour is far more culpable than a large corporation that ensures that its labour force is treated in accordance with good occupational health and safety and human rights principles. I was also involved in a practitioner's guide kit that was developed by Edmund Bon and Amma Bon in Malaysia on business and human rights, a practitioner's guide kit for SMEs on human rights compliance regarding the environment and labour. And one of the things we did focus on was the concept of due diligence, which is recognised by the UN guiding principles, and also by the OECD guidelines on multinational enterprises. The idea of due diligence and risk assessments that all enterprises can undertake. But for smaller enterprises, those risk assessments are much less intensive. For larger enterprises and family businesses, that can be very large, as we know in Thailand. Family businesses are actually the things that drive this economy.
Those family businesses, as I reference family business, but indeed, family businesses are some of the largest here.
And so that's why that due diligence and risk assessment is also important, because it can tailor the responses to the capacity of the enterprise.
Thank you for that contribution. It couldn't be more timely. I really do feel also that the issue of the challenge that SMEs present is percolating to the top of our agenda as well. So thank you for highlighting that knowledge product, and I look forward to reading it myself. But let me ask you a quick question on that. Outside of risk assessment, outside of doing due diligence, though, isn't part of the problem that sustainability solutions are too expensive to begin with? Do we have examples of affordable sustainability solutions for smaller enterprises that do want to manage their water pollution output, their air pollution outputs?
So again, it comes back to standards that governments have adopted, and most of the standards for water quality are fairly universal and match the enterprise. And there are techniques that are cost effective. But the question is always, if there is environmental and social harm caused by your product, surely, and we've been talking about this for as long as I've been an environmental lawyer, which is over 35 years, surely we have to factor that in. We called it the internalization of externalities. We've had the time to do that. We have had now the technology and the tools to do that. And whether it's air pollution monitoring or monitoring your water pollution, having particular techniques, these are all available. Doing things differently, these are all available. And if it costs more, it's because you're including the cost of your harm. And that's one of the reasons why I do say prosecute, 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 fine people. It's what Singapore does, and as a result, they have a very, very high quality for their water and their water systems. They make sure that their air pollution is kept under control. They do that because they want to ensure that corporations factor those in and compliance into their cost of doing business. And so when we talk about things being more expensive because you have to take into account environmental harm, that's what it's all about. We require corporations to do that, and that's their obligation. It's also the law. And if they break the law, they should be prosecuted. And the companies that don't break the law and comply, they're the ones that should be rewarded, and they have the market advantage. But I think we've gone beyond that point where we can just say it's voluntary compliance is enough.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you for those comments and your responses to my question. Let me turn back to Surya for a moment. With regards to UN guiding principles, is the era of voluntary measures coming to an end?
I don't see this as a divide between voluntary and binding. I think we need a combination of both, because binding rules can hardly be ambitious enough anywhere in the world. And it is difficult to agree on binding rules. They are poorly implemented. So I think we need binding rules. Definitely, I completely agree with Matthew in terms of prosecution and all this. So I think we need a combination of incentives and disincentives. One or the other alone will not do it. So we need binding rules as a starting point, because they will set the global minimum that we need to follow at the local level, at the regional level, international level. But we need voluntary rules which are more ambitious, in my view. So I think what we see is the other way around. We have voluntary rules which are setting the floor, and we have the binding rules which are patchy here and there and poorly implemented. So I will reverse the order. We need binding rules which are setting the floor and creating a global level playing field for businesses. And then I would like to have more ambitious voluntary things, and then the market may drive competitive advantage for some businesses on those rules.
Thank you, Surya. I actually have follow-up questions for each, but I realize there's probably many of you out there that have questions yourselves, and in fact, we have a good 20 minutes left for that purpose. I see one question, two, and three, and I'll go around the room. Ma'am, please take the floor.
I'm Bhanu. I'm from India. I'm from Arunachal Pradesh, which is the China-India border. So I am an anti-dam from an anti-dam collective, Dibang Resistance. So our river Dibang is one of the tributaries that flows from Sangpo from Tibet to India. Then it becomes Brahmaputra and flows to the Bay of Bengal. So it's one of the largest river basins. So I thought I want to take the angle of risk assessment that you guys have been mentioning. I would like to take this opportunity also to inform you that we are in seismic zone 5. In my valley alone, we have had, in 1 century, we have had more than 160 earthquakes recorded. And in fact, 8.6 magnitude was one of the largest, earthquakes in our valley, where the world's largest dams are being proposed. One is on the table, and the other one is already, been passed. So I think I really want to put it to Professor Surya Dev as well, that when we talk about, a green sense of energy, in the Northeast especially, there is very, very severe violations of human rights and also environmental, there's no compliance with the EIA, Environmental Impact Assessment. And these are the world's largest dams. We are talking about 3,000 plus megawatt, 2,000 plus megawatt. We're not addressing really 60 megawatt or 40 megawatt, right? And in a very seismic zone area. So what are the risk assessment we really address when we talk about addressing policies, etc., indigenous values, etc., right? There's always been there. There's voluntarily, we always know that, this is right, but mandatorily, as Matthew speak, I think I agree more with what we should do is prosecute really, the companies that have been forever violating these rivers.
Yeah. Right. Ma'am, are you asking for comment, or do you have a very specific question you would like to put to?
Yeah, so
just some reflections.
Yeah, so the question was, what about the risk assessment? Given that we are in very highly seismic zone areas, we have the largest dams of the world, tallest gravity dam being, allowed in our space in the seismic zone area. Where are we going from here?
What role of risk assessments and given the magnitude of the challenge? Weena, do you want to give that a shot, and then I'll pass it over to Surya.
Yeah, the whole question of dam is confusing. There was a huge report done, the World Dam report that was done way back, right? And there's a whole assessment of what is sustainable dams, right? And I think I'm confused as to why this whole debate has come back in the world on dams, right? Because dam has such huge environmental impact, massive. Here in Thailand too, we've had in Thailand the Thai government has actually been approached by many civil society groups within the Mekong region complaining because a lot of the dams are actually funded by Thai banks, supported by Thai governments, right? And it's sad that these things happen. I think there is the issue of, it's a whole ecosystem, but one thing that can actually be done, and a lot of people don't look at it in that perspective. I'm a financial economist by training. Going to the banks who actually fund it, because don't forget, banks get money from our deposit money, right? And then they go forth and they get into these huge project financing transactions, and it's devastating to the environment that we're all living in. So that's one big leverage that can be done, and that's one angle that a lot of groups have approached, which is to follow the money, because without that, these projects it's very hard to get them going.
Surya?
Risk assessment is complicated in situations of dam because companies or the governments already decide that this project has to go ahead. And then the risk assessment is done merely to tick the boxes and get the so-called approvals. I think that is problematic. So I would say that before a dam or any project is conceived, merely on paper as an idea, with no architect hired, no financial put in place, then we should consult with the local communities and look at the impact. Because the difficulty is that who is going to benefit from the energy that is going to be generated by a particular dam? Perhaps those indigenous people, local tribal community, they may not be getting the benefit. They may be adversely impacted. So I think that is the So it's not merely about energy safety and security. I would also consider, and it goes back to my point about degrowth, we need to reduce the energy consumption as well. When I was growing up as a child in my village in India, there was no electricity. So my father told me, you should put your goods in a room in a way that you can find in darkness. So can we survive without electricity? Yes, we used to. Can we eat our dinners before sunset? Yes, we can. So I think I'm talking about those fundamental changes in how we are living in this planet. And I don't think the risk assessment and human rights due diligence narrative that is predominant is capturing those transformative changes that I'm talking about here.
And that's something you're speaking to the degrowth idea, and as you say that, and give us very specific illustrations of what you mean. Thank you very much to both the respondents. We have a second question here. In the interest of time, we have 15 minutes. Very specific question. And then to my panelists, please also answer quickly too, so we can reach as many people as possible.
ก็พยายามจะพูดให้ช้า
I am trying to speak slowly, even though I have many issues. Sorry, I have never been into the mistakes on the interpreters this morning was because of me. I pressed the wrong buttons. That's why the voice of the interpreters came out in the room. Anyways, just showing that I am the first. It's my first time here. First of all, I want to talk about every person littering. If you litter and you pick it up, isn't that better? If you litter and when other pick it up, who's going to pick it up? So this is the situation in the world. This is how we live, right? So whatever business we do, they haven't done any responsibility to what they take, right? Why do I say that? Let's talk about the Thai state. Whenever they talk about forming laws, there are always rules. If you put the quality of life of people in the importance, there should be a lot of mechanics that you can do. This is something simple. Everything needs to be registered to the state, right? So with this registration, there should be a condition that says that your company needs to take liabilities. Every company needs to have take accountability on the damage that they do to the environment. Secondly, why do I have to say that? Because in Thailand, we live with the forest, right? I am the one who lives with the forest. They want to increase the forest mass to 40 million rai, and they're taking our land. And every time that they're taking that, they put the word climate change there. Yesterday, my friend said from Chayapum, they were being persecuted because they don't read they cannot read, and they just stamp their fingers there, and then they got prosecuted, they got charges, and so we have to pay 5 million for climate change, 5 million baht. Apart from the criminal charges that being faced, they have civil charges against them too. We see this everywhere that there's a forest in Thailand. So I want to say that the trees can take carbon and they put more, they can take oxygen. So they want to build more trees, but they're actually not thinking about the people living there, and they're asking us to sacrifice. I actually want the whole society to take blame, not just us. We have no safety in our lives, way of life at all, and right now. So.
For that intervention and sharing the urgency of the issues you're facing. I didn't hear question so much, but I know, Weena would like to reflect on it for just a moment, and then I'll go take the third question in the corner. Thank you.
Should I do it in English or Thai?
Up to you. We have translation.
Oh, okay.
Maybe in Thai.
Okay.
May I answer on these issues? In Thailand, we have, when there is a bill on public gathering and community, and the only factor that in the bill was the word community, but that is why we have issues of environment today. So I want to say that there is a lack of understanding on this issue. What we're trying to do in our Clean Air Act, there's also a systematic structure that we want to have the committee set up that includes the community, because we believe truly that the people in the community understands the most on the environmental issues, and they are the one who can help set up policies as well as monitoring and due diligence. This is how we will transform the environment policies. If this is able to do, it can scale up into other issues as well. Hope this government will be difficult. Yes, I agree.
I believe has the next question, and then I will take a question here, question in the middle on this side, one in the very back there. If time permitting, please. So please make your question or intervention very short. Thank you.
Yes, I like quite a bit the idea of green degrowth. My question is related to the fact that there is a low sensibility apparently in Asia in about environmental trouble until it affects seriously the community. But then there is also a lack of funds for the government to fight these problems that we don't even see, like the air pollution. I would like to ask Professor Surya and also Mr. Matthew about the European carbon tax. That seems to be an interesting tool set up by the polluting Western country, for which the revenues will actually be invested in the developing countries. Thank you.
Yes, I think we need more of that because what is happening is that Europe and the global north generally has kept itself pollution free because all the manufacturing is moved to Asia and the global south. So we have suffered. Now we are being blamed for all this, and the consumers and everyone living in the global north is enjoying it for many years, not just now, historically. That's why I brought the colonial angle as well to this debate. And I think we need to fix this. And I think that's where the issue of tax is one component of it. But I think they have to give billions of dollars in assistance to the global south, in my view. And the technology has to be transferred. So it has to be a package of assistance. Otherwise, we are not going to fix it.
But then the EU legislation has finally understood the problems of Asia.
I don't think so, because they're not targeting the right kind of business enterprises. How many businesses in Asia have been consulted by the people who are drafting this directive?
Not many. Certainly not many. Thank you for that exchange. An excellent question. Sir, I'm sorry, to the left here, and then you, sir, in the yellow in a moment.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Frederick Wilson from the Asia Indigenous People PAC, working with the right of indigenous peoples. So I like the idea of human rights due diligence and also risk assessment. It should be embodied and also translated into the action by the states as well as the company. So while talking about the regulation and also environmental priorities and human rights agenda, you see in Asia, it is the largest number of indigenous people. It is estimated around 411 millions live in this region. And indigenous people territories is 20% in the global area is home to 80% of world biodiversity. In Asia itself, around 8.7% of territories held by indigenous peoples and other local communities are legally recognized. Most of the countries in Asia, we have seen they've ratified the United Nations treaties, for example, the ICCPR, ICED, and also CEDAW, among others. And national climate policies, to some extent, which international commitment and also obligation have been translated into recognition and respect and protection for the right of indigenous people in the national legal framework. For example, in the Philippines, Indonesia, and Cambodia. However, in Nepal, there's a weak protection for indigenous people as well as the Bangladesh. They only refer to the protection of culture and not related land and resource rights, despite the commitment under United Nations Declaration Right of Indigenous Peoples. There's a clearly said indigenous peoples should recognize, and also when we talk about in the country context, they often justify all people present in the geographical area before colonization are indigenous peoples. In such case, it's alternative to mention they are such hill tribes, some of them ethnic minorities, aboriginal peoples, scheduled tribe, upajati, minor races, national races. The question here, is it any way so that we can recognize the indigenous peoples in each states to all of them. Mr. Chair, regardless the level of legal recognition or protection, the reality is that indigenous people facing a lot of threats in the social, political, cultural, and economic discrimination, even where rights are protected on the paper, but there is no details, requirement, or guideline for the enforcement. And as a result, indigenous people regularly experience threats in their ancestral land territories and also from the extraction, conservation, and infrastructure. And I would like to highlight some of the example here.
Sir, can I ask you to stop there and just to allow me to, because we have only 5 minutes left, we have 2 more questions, and I will come back to you where you provide those examples if there's time permitting. I can tell that when we get into the examples, that's when it's very hard for us to limit discussion. Let me just say this, though, that the power of what you've articulated already makes many of us firmly believe, I think I speak for the panel in saying this, that indigenous people, the rights of the indigenous peoples are rights that impact us all, and in fact have a direct linkage to our environmental well-being of our planet. And so I think that increasingly, and I'm feeling it at this forum. I don't know if you're feeling it either yourself, rather, but that the indigenous peoples, the issues that they are facing are the issues that we are facing, and I want you to know that we feel as one with regards to your concerns. Please do table the rest of your statement with us, and we will put it on our website, and I'd like to unpack the issues and the examples with you going forward in more detail. Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Hello,
Gentleman
sir.
in yellow, please.
Thank you. I'm John from Assam, India. I'm from the Tayahum Indigenous community. In our region, mining of coal, production of oil and gas, and existing and construction of big dams are causing a huge biological impact on the environment. Mining of coal and production of oil started way back in the colonial era. Now we have a recently amended Mines and Mineral Act in India where emphasis is given on self-reliance, but this will lead to devastating consequences for our people. Our rivers are turning black due to coal mining. The river ecosystem is changing. Oil and gas production, oil and gas leaks from wells and pipelines are leading to air, water, and soil pollution. The whole biodiversity is changing. Moreover, huge taxes and fines are being imposed for pollution by vehicles while they themselves allow deforestation in the name of businesses. Also, many activists are being detained for calling out for different issues, including environment, due to the draconian law called Armed Forces Special Powers Act 1958, which is still imposed in Northeast India. So I have a question. What are the mandatory steps this forum will suggest to our government so that top priority is given to human environment before any business practices, as the already existing environmental laws and human rights are being violated completely? Thank you.
Thank you. Did you want to put that question to someone on our panel?
Or anyone who can answer.
Thank you. So I think some of these sort of key steps or priority mandatory regulations that we should have should include things like polluter pays principles, like Weena mentioned earlier, because that really does internalize the externality. So that means that the company or the business that is producing, that has the coal mine, they have to bear the costs of the environmental impact and the associated health impacts on the local population. Without something like the polluter pays principle, then it's the local population that has to bear the whole cost, or it's the overall general taxpayers who have to pay the cost through increased healthcare burdens, for example, on the population. So I think polluter pays should really be a gold standard as a starting point.
And I think, thank you, Diane. I think Surya also has a response.
I just wanted to add a footnote to the polluter pays principle because it has come up several times on the panel. And I completely agree we need to adopt this principle. But I also wanted to add a limitation. Many businesses would think that we are willing to pay this much of a fine as part of the polluter pay because we're going to make much more profit. So I think the polluter pays principle also has limitations. So I wanted to flag it. And that's where I think what I will call the red line approach becomes crucial. Certain things should not be allowed on the part of businesses, period. Then we don't need to bring in that cost element in those issues.
Thank you, Surya. And I'm going to ask each speaker hereafter, and sorry, you just had your that opportunity. In the remaining 60 seconds we have to either respond to that last question, or to make an important point that they want this group here to leave with. So let me start with Matthew.
Thank you. And I think it's the theoretical and the practical. So one thing that is so vital, and I heard it yesterday, I hear it today, is the role of environmental and human rights defenders. And we're at this panel on business and human rights where my very good friend Vicky Bowman, the director of the Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business, was arrested by the Myanmar dictatorship 3 weeks ago and has been sentenced to a year in jail because of her visa issues, failure to report. But the consequence of that arrest, which was clearly illegal, clearly unconstitutional, clearly in violation of her human rights, has meant that one of the great centres dealing with responsible business in Myanmar and in this region has now closed, which shows that without protecting our environmental and human rights defenders, none of this discussion matters, because the people who are protecting the environment, protecting their societies, need to be protected so that they can say and talk to business and government. The second thing is that all of the things we are talking about, whether it's degrowth or environmental, the application of principles such as environment, social government, risk or risk assessment and due diligence, all of these things have to occur at every single stage of the project cycle. The feasibility, we've now got to get the banks involved, the financial institutions, the governments, the regulators, the enterprises who are doing the construction, how they treat their workers, how they treat their communities. And if they fail to live up to the standards, we have to take them to court, the court of public opinion. We have to make complaints about them. We have to demonstrate that compliance with those norms of human rights and environmental protection are what is needed now. And if that costs a little bit more, if that forces some businesses not to dam our rivers and chop our trees down, well, that's a good thing. And so that's what I would have to say. Protect our environmental and human rights defenders so they can make sure these things are brought, and make sure every part of the development cycle is acquainted with the need for environmental and social obligations and human rights protections. And let's make them live up to that obligations.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thank
That's
you.
a very powerful statement. And on behalf of Vicky and all environmental human rights defenders. 30 seconds or less.
Okay, I speak very fast. Okay, a couple of things. First of all, I think a lot of what I hear from yesterday and today goes to the point that I think a lot of people aren't being heard. There are a lot of violations happening, and I think it speaks. I mean, degrowth. I do agree with that. There needs to be thinking on that, but also what you cannot measure, you cannot manage. And one of the things I wish more governments would look into is the concept of a well-being budget. How you can say any of the projects you want to go ahead with, what is the implication intergenerationally? Can you justify it? Because that's how it all starts off, right? If you can't justify it intergenerationally, then it should not go ahead. And the environment is definitely part of all of that. So I think that this part is gravely missing. The other part, I must say, Sean, just to be a little bit controversial, this is a responsible business and human rights forum. I don't see a lot of representation from business. They're not here. I don't see a lot of representation from policymakers too, which is gravely needed.
On that note, though, there are a number of business associations here that do represent other businesses. So we have the Responsible Business Alliance, the Global Compact Networks are here, a number of different, Global Business Initiative is also here representing large multinationals. So they are represented through their representatives.
Okay, that's great. Sorry.
But I would also like to suggest that there are actually individual company representatives here too. It's sustainability, working in sustainability field.
Just one final note I want to say about on the sustainability angle and on environment. I think I don't know if people know this. In Thailand, in northern part of Thailand, you have children about 14 years old getting abnormal growth on their lungs. Right, this is a telltale sign of lung cancer. And I know it gets really bad because I know in India, their children are about 8 or 9 years old getting similar things, right? So I think what I wanted to end with is this is something that is, you know, if you take your hat off, it's all about us, right? It's about your life and the life of your kids. There is no us or them in all of this debate. And I do wish that all hands would be on deck in terms of solving the environmental crisis that we are all facing. Because as a global community, we have done that before. September 16th was the anniversary of the Ozone Day. The world did come together and solve that crisis 35 years ago successfully, and it needed everybody and every hands on deck. Unfortunately, I don't know why that doesn't seem to be the case on environmental issues, whether it's air pollution or anything else. Yeah.
Thank you, Weena. We're going to give the last word to Diane, and unfortunately we have to close out our session.
Okay, thank you. Well, I agree with everything my panelists have suggested so far. I think just a final note that we mustn't forget about informal workers who fall outside often of legal frameworks and so get left behind. We have to recognize they also have a right to earn their livelihood, and so there's a responsibility here on governments to provide the necessary framework to support them and the environment in which they work, so access to insurance, social security, but also help them, for example, if we're shifting towards a greener economy, to be able to access the greener technologies that they need, the safety equipment that they need to be able to work safely without being penalized. So that doesn't mean target taxi drivers for taking their cars off the road because their cars are old, but rather work with taxi drivers to find a solution that they can afford so that they can continue to earn a livelihood whilst also polluting less with their cars.
Thank you very much, Diane. We will need to start unpacking what those solutions are, though, in new rounds, because we keep saying we need to find solutions, but those solutions now need to get on the table and fast. I did have a conclusion to make myself, but we are out of time. A sweeping conversation that was also well informed by lots of interesting detail. I think you'd agree. This was an excellent conversation and one that we're going to have many, many more times going into the future. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here.